Professor Diane Desierto is a professor of law and global affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Her expertise is in international law generally, human rights law, international economic law, international arbitration, and development. And the reason I wanted her with us today, thanks for being with us, is a very interesting blog post that she wrote on Equal Talk that really analyzed these issues of global food security in a very useful way. And once again, we're grateful for having you through Zoom with us.
Thank you very much, Professor Itamar. And my apologies for not being there in person, but if it's any consolation, it's 7 a.m. here at Notre Dame. And I did wake up early to deliver this presentation. Let me share my screen now. And I appreciate the factual discussions that were given by our previous panelists. My task here today is to talk about the international law, both in terms of international human rights law, but also the general law of state responsibility that is implicated from the continuing Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there are two aspects to this. One that directly affects Ukraine and its populations, particularly on serious violations of the human right to food, the use of starvation as a prohibited war tactic, and the continued endangerment of global food security for the rest of the world as a result of this unlawful aggression and prohibited aggression by Russia. When Russia undertook its prohibited means of warfare, there were already deteriorating food conditions and global food crises being experienced throughout the world. What our colleagues spoke about earlier as the imposition of an artificial famine is absolutely true. There is a convergence or confluence of both famine, starvation, and what I'm particularly concerned about, the long-term destruction of agri-food production. We're not talking here about a crisis that will occur for 1 year or what to do about grain exports that are older or have a natural expiration date. We're talking about the long-term destruction of agri-food production by Ukraine and how that impacts the rest of the world. The FAO already noted that as of 2019 to 2021, much of the world that's indicated in the map here in orange and various colors and shades was already experiencing massive hunger. You will note that that refers to parts of Asia, parts of Latin America, and Africa, the African continent for the most part. These are the 3 most affected developing regions that are impacted from the severe crises that has been inflicted by Russia as a result of its actions. Food insecurity has also worsened, where many parts of the world, most parts of the world already experience moderate or severe food insecurity exacerbated by Russian actions in Ukraine. These are some footages of what various think tanks, particularly CSIS, the Center for Strategic Studies, have pointed out, or at least have been able to see by way of the long-term destruction of various agri-food infrastructure within Ukraine. Here, there's a dairy farm that's been shelled. Here, the destruction of various food storage facilities and sheds and silos, among others. The destruction of agricultural fields with bomb and rocket impact craters throughout the agricultural fields. Smoke from bomb and rocket impacts throughout agricultural fields. And again, continuing destruction from rocket and impact craters, which affect not just the immediate ability to till the soil, but the long-term arability of the land itself because of the environmental consequences from using these kinds of weapons. There are also, again, here tracks. And this is where at least there's the latest map that shows where food imports are now affected by the Ukraine crisis. You find that the areas that are marked in red are those where the share of food imports per country are most affected by export restrictions. And as was pointed out earlier, while there has been some release with respect to wheat and corn production, that has not been the same across the board for all of Ukraine's crops. Here is another photo that was taken from the conflict observatory, Yale's conflict observatory, that was also referenced by the United States State Department and by the United Nations, that showed that Russian targeting in particular extended to agri-food facilities and infrastructure, and extensive damage to the lower part of the screen of this photo. These are food storage or food grain storage, long-term storage facilities that have been damaged and shelled as a result of the conflict. Further destruction of structures, destruction of silos, and damage to more agri-food infrastructure. And this map right here is the latest map that's used by the United Nations to document the extent of environmental conditions that have impacted Ukraine as a result of Russian bombing and Russian aggression for well over 6 months now. So we're looking at long-term damage to the soil, long-term damage to agri-food production, long-term damage to the infrastructure that guarantees Ukraine's sustainability of its own food production. And the wider map over here also tracks the extent to which in Russian-controlled areas there have been strikes in industrial facilities, airports, military facilities, the use of radioactive materials, the destruction of strategic resource control locations, and in particular, my particular concern here are the damage to nature and protected areas, which very much extend to agricultural production in Ukraine. It was reported a few months ago by Politico that the World Food Program was already delivering humanitarian food supplies, but prior to the Green Corridors Treaty, no humanitarian convoys could reach the particular areas within Ukraine, cities that need the access to humanitarian assistance. And that's already, at least in their assessment, 40 million people who need that access to food, to the right to food in particular during this crisis. That being said, thus, what implicates Russian responsibilities, among others, under international human rights law and general international law? In the first place, Russia is a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. There's a continuing obligation on the part of the state to continue to take steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical, with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of rights recognized in this covenant, especially the human right to food. Ironically, it was the Russian Federation, or I should say its predecessor, the Soviet Union, that proposed the human right to food when the covenant was drafted back in the 1960s, and in particular insisted that the human right to food must include dimensions of physical and economic accessibility, adequacy, and availability to populations not only within the territory of a state, but in territories that are administered by a state outside of its immediate sovereign territory. This is precisely why, in the 2004 Wall Advisory Opinion, the International Court of Justice recognized that the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights has extraterritorial effect, especially in the case of occupied territories such as Palestine, and in this case, Ukraine. The particular provision on the right to food here is Article 11, where as a state party to the covenant, Russia also guarantees the right to adequate food and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. Paragraph 2 of this provision is specifically important because we're looking here about the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. and thus the measures that should be taken by states are meant to either improve methods of production, conservation, and distribution of food, or to take into account the problems of both food importing and food exporting countries, ensuring that equitable distribution of world food supplies in relation to need. Based on the maps and the images that I've shown you previously, clearly Russia has paid no heed whatsoever either to the human right to food in particular of Ukrainians, or for third states that are impacted severely by actions of the Russian Federation's troops in destroying agri-food infrastructures on the ground in Ukraine. This is precisely why, in its general comment, the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights says that violations of the right to food can occur through the direct action of states, and these can include the denial of access to food to particular individuals or groups, the prevention of access to humanitarian food aid in conflicts or other emergency situations, the failure to regulate the activities of individuals or groups so as to prevent them from violating the right to food of others, or the failure of a state to take into account its international legal obligations regarding the right to food when entering into agreements with other states or with international organizations. So much has been said about the Green Corridors Treaty that was brokered by Turkey between Russia and Ukraine. But flowing from Russian obligations involving the human right to food includes a particular necessity to ensure that its international legal obligations should have been taken into account in drafting that Green Corridors Treaty. Was it enough that a humanitarian corridor or 6 humanitarian corridors were set up? Absolutely not, at least insofar as ensuring the continued enjoyment of the right to food was concerned. Using starvation, the continued use of starvation tactics, the continued destruction of facilities that are civilian facilities and clearly agricultural facilities, and the long-term environmental destruction that is inflicted in Ukraine that will impair its ability to ensure the arability of its land and the long-term sustainability of its production is not taking into account the international legal obligations that Russia has, especially when it comes to the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. The long-term development of Ukraine, which is also seriously imperiled as a result of the destruction of agri-food sectors and infrastructure and facilities, is also a particular concern when one also takes into account what my own interests are as well in this case on the right to development and Ukraine's right to development in particular, which has been impeded by this continuing act of illegal aggression. Further, it is important to note here that this is not about Russia providing food so much as ensuring at a minimum the obligation to respect that there should be existing access to adequate food that would not be prevented by Russian actions. Now, it's astonishing that as of September 2022, we are continually brokering or attempting to broker negotiations with Russia to ensure access not just to its many ports, but in particular to ensure the timely seasonal production of food as a result of the destruction of so much of Ukraine's agricultural infrastructure and the arability in particular of its land and the possibility for sustainable food production season to season, cycle to cycle. At the very minimum, this jeopardizes, violates, and impairs Russia's continuing obligation to respect that existing access to adequate food for the Ukrainian population, as well as for all other third states that are dependent on that access to food. Beyond that, as the occupying power in certain parts of Ukraine, Russia is already under continuing obligation to protect that right to food, to ensure that individuals or other enterprises also do not deprive civilian populations of their access to adequate food. there is a proactive dimension here as well in the obligation to fulfill, which the Russian obligation has in this instance. It is to proactively engage activities that are intended to strengthen people's access to and utilization of resources to ensure food security. And thus, whenever an individual or group is unable to enjoy the right to adequate food, Russia, as the occupying power, has that obligation to fulfill that right directly. Thus, to me, even if there is some improvement with a green corridors treaty, that is so far below the threshold of what is required under international human rights law. And ironically, in the travaux préparatoires to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, again, it was the Russian Federation, its predecessor, the Soviet Union, who insisted on these elaborated obligations on the adequacy and access and availability and accessibility of the right to food, which it is now violating in its continuing aggression in Ukraine. The other consequence of this as well is one that also implicates an obligation of immediate effect for Russia insofar as the covenant is concerned. There's an obligation not to discriminate for all covenant rights under the Economic, Social, Cultural Rights Covenant. The discrimination taking place here is clearly on the basis or on the ground of race, on the basis of political or other opinion, on the basis of national or social origin, by ensuring that that access to food is guaranteed only for its particular troops and especially impaired for Ukrainian civilian populations whose continued enjoyment or exercise of economic, social, and cultural rights should continue to persist even in theaters of international armed conflict. This, thus, in my view, brings about not just the continuing obligations of Russia, which are seriously being impaired here and violated with impunity under both international human rights law and international humanitarian law, specifically under the Fourth Geneva Convention. But most importantly, under the law of state responsibility, their continuing obligations of non-recognition for third states, where, as we recall from the 2001 articles on the international responsibility of states, a breach of breaches of peremptory norms of general international law, which may in this case include serious violations of war, or rather serious commission of war crimes and serious violations of international human rights law that are gross or systemic, can rise to the level of serious breaches of obligations under peremptory norms of general international law. Article 41 makes it very clear that states are supposed to cooperate to bring to an end through lawful means any of these serious breaches within the meaning of Article 40. And no state shall recognize as lawful that situation that is created by a serious breach within the meaning of Article 40. So what does this mean? Insofar as the agreement, the Green Corridors Agreement is concerned, where Russia has sought the release of sanctions, some sanctions, in exchange for stopping or abating some starvation or minimizing the weaponization of starvation as a war tactic, or ensuring some humanitarian access or food security access. This is not permissible under international law. You cannot broker illegality. The sanctions are in place as legitimate countermeasures, and it is not consistent with Russia's obligations under the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, specifically the continuing duty to ensure the right to an adequate standard of living through adequate food and global food security, which is related to the human right to food. It is not permitted to trade rights for rights in this particular instance. And so the bare minimum that Russia has employed to conclude the Green Corridors Treaty is itself particularly problematic. It is well short of what is required of Russia under international law. It is certainly not, at least in my view, not permissible for Russia to continue its ongoing human rights violations that implicate the peoples of Ukraine as well as the rest of the world, particularly the three regions of Latin America, Africa, and Asia that I've pointed out earlier. To this end, and let me stop here, what are some of the conclusions that we have? The conclusions I have here is that one, that Green Corridors Treaty is not enough to address the long-term violations of the human right to food. We're looking at long-term environmental destruction as a result of this conflict, the long-term destruction of the sustainability of agri-food production in Ukraine, and the environmental destruction that will also impair food quality and food adequacy over the long term. Third states, secondly, have legal duties not to recognize these continuing serious violations of the human right to food, in particular, giving aid or assistance to Ukraine that enables it to continue to prosecute this war with impunity. And third, the global food insecurity that I showed you from the beginning, as of 2022, is deepening already because of Russia's continuing invasion and destruction in the long term of Ukraine's agricultural infrastructure. And finally, my fourth point here, starvation for sanctions release is not a legal countermeasure under the general law of international responsibility. I'll stop here and thank you very much for the opportunity to present.